So now let me give the floor to Ms. Alice Vairimun Deritu for her concluding remarks. Madam, you have 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I'll begin with many questions that were asked regarding the relationship between our office and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, including whether we have a relationship of sharing information. And I was quite taken aback, as I'm sure the High Commissioner of Human Rights would be, because that's the office that we work closest to. My mandate actually specifically asks me to work closely with the High Commissioner for Human Rights as well as with DPPA. And we issued statements in collaboration in the past. It's the only USG with who we've issued statements in collaboration with has been the High Commissioner for Human Rights on issues that we felt needed our specific joint action. That was on Myanmar and on DRC. As you know, we are a small office. We don't have field presences. We rely on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to provide for us the support from the field presences of human rights officers around the world. And of course, we work very closely with special rapporteurs. If you've been to any of our webinars, you'll probably notice that they are always moderated by the special rapporteurs. We work closely with treaty bodies, and I'll talk specifically in the interest of time about just one of them, which has been specifically asked a question on. And so there is absolutely no gap between Geneva and New York, and actually even in terms of the design of our offices. The ASG for Human Rights and I are neighbors in New York. We share the same wall. And how do we encourage tech and social media companies? Tomorrow, we are issuing a policy and based on 3 years of conversation, Chatham House Rules conversations with tech and social media companies. And it's a very balanced, it looks at both sides of the approach of when the negativity and the positivity and what needs to be done going forward. And I'll be coming back here in December for a brief based on this human rights resolution 499. And then on the question of R2P not being adequately resourced, and I'm grateful to the government of Australia for the grant that you give to our office that specifically requests or specifically tells the office that the grant supports the work of both offices. However, also glad that this issue was raised because we are a very poorly resourced office and we need the support of member states to improve the budget of this office. And as regards the poor resourcing of the R2P, I would say that the main thing that the Special Advisor on R2P does, we know, is draft the report for the Secretary General for R2P. And like, for example, this year, with our budget of $38,000 for consultants, we paid $15,000 to the consultant who drafted the report. And that really is the extent of the support that we give R2P. We are conscious on a very daily basis that R2P is something that member states agree to and that therefore needs our support. In terms of SAD, there's been the question raised about the issue of Xinjiang. And I'll give you, because we also got the same question from Reuters and through the spokesperson, so I'll give you the public response that we give to this question, especially because we've had a meeting already in person with the SAD president, and I'm coming back here. When I come back here in December, one of the things I'm doing is having a session with SAD. And the response that we gave is that we are aware of the recent decision of the SAD. In this regard, we note that the revised version of the SAD guidelines on early warning and urgent action procedures adopted in August of 2007 envisage the possibility that the committee's measures under the early warning and urgent action procedure include the adoption of a decision including the expression for actions addressed to inter alia, the special advisor to the Secretary General on the prevention of genocide. And we shared the guidelines that can be found there in the specific page 115 to 118, and also noted that the referral was made to the special advisor on the responsibility to protect and not to the special advisor on the prevention of genocide. And we don't know whether this could be simply that the revised SAD guidelines were adopted before the position of special advisor on the responsibility to protect was established in 2008. it's one of the things that we'll be discussing when I come back in December. In terms of what measures should Brazil take, Brazil has ratified the Convention of the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Brazil has very strong rule of law institutions. Brazil has the capacity to take action and also make decisions as signatory to the Rome Statute in terms of what other actions they need to take. For ratifications, thank you very much for bringing that out. And also I'd like to point out that last year we got a ratification from the Republic of Zambia. So we are still getting there slowly and surely. Ratifications, of course, are a constant conversation that requires continuity. So we'll get there. For question from the Excellency from Switzerland, what are the main atrocity contexts which today call for action? I think I've just outlined them in the statement that I just issued. In terms of the calls to work on issues, I would say, just to emphasize that we draw the legal framework for our office from the 1948 Genocide Convention, and we do not work retroactively. There was also the question in terms of actionable recommendations for specific countries, and I would emphasize that the brief that I've issued today had a number of actionable recommendations, and that any statement that I issue actually always has an actionable recommendation. So whatever we've discussed today, the brief that we put out today will of course be shared and put out. And again, once again, I would like to invite you. We will share again the invite for tomorrow for the launch of our plan of action for online countering online hate speech with tech and social media companies. Thank you.
Thank you. Active participation in this dialogue. Also, colleagues, many thanks to you. We will now take a short break before the presentation of reports under agenda item 3. So let me conclude for a while. Excellencies, colleagues, we will now proceed with the presentation of the thematic reports submitted by the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights and his office. I give the floor to Ms. Peggy Hicks, Director of the Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and Right to Development Division of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for the presentation. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues. It's a pleasure to introduce 1 oral and 5 written reports of the Secretary General and the High Commissioner for Human Rights on a range of thematic issues to be considered under Item 3. Let me start by presenting OHCHR's oral report to the Council on the implementation of the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy, UNDIS, across its programs and operations as requested in Human Rights Council Resolution 4912. OHCHR has maintained its performance to date and improved in some areas. In the area of programs and projects, as reported to the Secretary General, we have improved our performance. We are now approaching fulfillment of the requirements under this indicator with the development of a guidance note on mainstreaming disability inclusion in program and project funding proposals. Meanwhile, we continue to exceed performance in 4 areas, namely on leadership, disability-specific policy, reasonable accommodation, and joint initiatives. First, on leadership, OHCHR remains dedicated to fulfilling the specific actions outlined in the UN Human Rights Disability Rights Strategy to strengthen its leadership on disability rights and ensures consistent engagement of the High Commissioner and Deputy High Commissioner in both public and internal processes in this regard. In 2022, a comprehensive evaluation of the Disability Rights Strategy was conducted through an internal participatory process leading to subsequent remedial actions. Second, in the area of disability-specific policy, in 2022, OHCHR updated its annual action plan to continue improving on the implementation of its indicators, and in 2023, OHCHR updated its policy on disability rights. Third, on reasonable accommodation, in 2022, a specific budget line was created to support reasonable accommodation. Fourth, in the area of joint initiatives, OHCHR implemented 2 projects funded by the UN Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Fund. In one project, focused on climate change, OHCHR partnered with the International Labour Organization and the International Disability Alliance. In another project, focused on care and support systems, OHCHR partnered with UNICEF and the International Disability Alliance. We continue to meet requirements in the areas of institutional setup as well as evaluation. In 2022, the model terms of reference for evaluations were revised to further address the integration of disability inclusion, which was continuously applied in all evaluations conducted in 2022. More information about our performance can be found in the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy Report, which is available on our website, including an easy-to-read version of the report. It's worth noting that to sustain and further improve our performance, additional resources and enhanced capacity is necessary. It would enable us to effectively address areas where further improvements are needed, such as in the area of accessibility and the area of country program documents, and to ensure continued progress across all indicators. In this regard, state support to accelerate improvement would be much appreciated. Turning now to the first of the written reports, the Secretary General's report on the impact of technological advances on prevention of genocide efforts and on the risks of perpetration of genocide. The report focuses on how technological advances can help prevent genocide. It also takes stock of risks that digital technologies can pose to the right to freedom of expression and human rights. Digital technologies have expanded and reshaped civic space and public participation and enhanced prevention efforts. The widespread and low-cost availability of tools to monitor human rights violations that could lead to genocide, often in real time, have improved evidence gathering and information sharing and allowed for more effective early warning. However, digital technologies may also open avenues to new forms of human rights violations, which pose risks to the prevention of genocide. The right to freedom of expression and other human rights can be curtailed by internet shutdowns or by imposing undue limitations on issues that can be discussed online. While hate speech and incitement to violence are substantial concerns offline, the rise of social media has greatly increased their speed and spread. The increasing use of artificial intelligence technologies risks deepening existing inequalities and discrimination, and may also be misused for surveillance purposes. Too often, states parties use hate speech and incitement laws to silence critics and opponents while failing to address threats resulting from speech that incite discrimination or violence. Technological safeguards are needed to ensure the prevention of genocide and protection of human rights in the digital space. States should meet their obligations under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to safeguard against human rights harms by companies, including by requiring due diligence throughout the life cycle of technological tools and digital infrastructure and integrating specific risk factors related to atrocity crimes. Technology companies also play a key role and should be stakeholders in the creation of a rights-based, inclusive digital space. I am pleased to present as well the High Commissioner's report on the implementation and enhancement of international cooperation in the field of human rights. This report is presented in response to HRC Resolution 50-4, which requested the High Commissioner to report on the work of OHCHR in the implementation and enhancement of international cooperation in the field of human rights, and propose possible ways to face the challenges to the promotion and protection of human rights, including the right to development. On the threshold of the 75th and 30th anniversaries of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action, and against the backdrop of our common agenda and the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, the report highlights the need to rekindle the spirit of these instruments to strengthen international cooperation in the pursuit of mutually reinforcing and foundational policy pathways to transformative change. It also emphasizes that human rights must be at the heart of a new social contract and more inclusive and effective multilateralism. OHCHR's activities on the implementation and enhancement of the international cooperation in the field of human rights take place primarily through 1. Global advocacy, 2. Joint United Nations efforts, 3. In-country presences, and 4. Operationalizing the right to development. They aim to strengthen international cooperation to enable states to deliver on their obligations and rights holders to claim their rights. Technical assistance and capacity building, including to implement the recommendations of the United Nations Human Rights Mechanisms, is a key means of cooperation and a major component of OHCHR's work in this area and requires increased financial resources. The report recommends that the UN urgently step up its ambition and operationalization of human rights integration and common country analyses and cooperation frameworks. Gaps to be addressed include the lack of attention to the intersectional nature of discrimination and the structural drivers of inequalities and exclusion, as well as to civic space and meaningful participation. Recommendations from human rights mechanisms could also be better used to address development challenges. The report calls on member states to work together to adopt a legally binding instrument on the right to development and operationalize this right. All forms of international cooperation, including North-South, South-South, triangular, regional, and multi-stakeholder, must be centered on human rights. Global human rights indicators and data, including in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, can help concretize the interlinkages between human rights, development, and peace. In partnership with OHCHR, member states must cooperate to nurture synergies in producing and using disaggregated human rights indicators and data, especially in assessing the use of maximum available resources to realize human rights. I now wish to draw your attention to the High Commissioner's report on the negative human rights impact of civilian acquisition, possession, and use of firearms, and underlying root causes and risk factors driving the availability of firearms and firearms-related violence. The High Commissioner's report on the civilian acquisition, possession, and use of firearms focuses on the ways in which business enterprises, in particular the firearms industry, contribute to the availability of firearms by driving supply and demand. The firearms industry contributes to the supply of firearms through their production and sale, domestically and through the international arms trade. Firearms manufacturers often fully or partially establish their operations in jurisdictions with permissive conditions for the manufacture and sale of firearms, or to help them gain access to new markets. The report notes the practice by the firearms industry of producing civilian firearms with increased lethality, including assault-style rifles. It further notes allegations that manufacturers supply communities with more firearms than could be expected to sell on the lawful market, and use distribution channels that regularly yield criminal end users, including through firearms trafficking to third states. The report also documents how businesses contribute to driving the demand for firearms. The firearms industry is increasingly appealing to fear-driven motives, using the argument that the civilian acquisition of firearms increases safety and thereby prompting complaints to the authorities of unfair and deceptive marketing. Marketing to men regularly associates the acquisition and possession of firearms with masculinity and military themes, including through imagery that resembles video games. To reach new demographics, the industry has increasingly targeted advertisement to women, children, and youth. The industry is increasingly using social media to market and sell firearms online on online platforms, and has established formal and informal relationships with the movie and video game industries. The report finds that the firearms industry, including firearms industry associations, manufacturers, and dealers, have not taken adequate steps to conform with the guiding principles on business and human rights. It cites examples of attempts to self-regulate, at least one of which was met by boycotting, and the use of lobbying and lawsuits to halt stricter firearms regulation by states. The report concludes with recommendations to states and businesses. States should increase their efforts to address the negative human rights impacts resulting from contributions by businesses to drive supply and demand for firearms by civilians. Among other recommendations, states should, first, reduce the number of firearms in circulation. Second, ensure individually and in cooperation the enforcement of firearms legislation, including the prevention of trafficking. Third, introduce requirements to manufacture and the sale of firearms, including firearms safety and enhanced due diligence requirements. Fourth, repeal immunities for entities operating the. And fifth, prevent marketing promoting discrimination or violence and advertisement misrepresenting the relationship between firearms possession and safety. The firearms industry is urged to meet its responsibilities under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to prevent, mitigate, and remedy the negative human rights impact of their operations. Turning now to the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the relationship between human rights and technical standard-setting processes for new and emerging technologies and the practical application of the guiding principles on business and human rights to the activities of technology companies. This report was requested by Council Resolution 4723 and is the first in-depth analysis by the United Nations of the human rights side of technical standard setting, a topic of growing importance for the exercise of human rights in an environment that is increasingly dependent on digital technologies. Given the position of the International Telecommunications Union in the standard-setting world, the report is also of particular importance within the United Nations. The report explains the role of the actors involved, from standard-setting organizations to states, businesses, enterprises, and civil society actors. It illustrates the breadth of positive and negative impacts of technical standards on the enjoyment of the full range of human rights and identifies challenges and possible solutions to better integrating human rights considerations in technical standard setting. The report identifies a widespread lack of human rights expertise and capacity within standard-setting processes, as well as persistent transparency gaps. Processes are often opaque and complicated, while frequently failing to seek or accept meaningful public inputs. The report also discusses shortcomings in participation within standard-setting organizations, noting standard-setting processes' overall lack of diversity in terms of thematic expertise, cultural, professional, institutional, social economic backgrounds, geographical representation, and gender. All this undermines the consistent integration of human rights into standard-setting processes. Addressing these challenges requires sustained multidimensional efforts by states, standard-setting organizations, and all stakeholders. Human rights must be placed front and center in these efforts. Standard-setting processes should rest on the multi-stakeholder principles and be as transparent, open, and inclusive as possible. While some standard-setting organizations have recognized the need for such actions and have initiated valuable programs to overcome gaps, more efforts are needed. To support such efforts, OHCHR is initiating a project on technical standard setting to contribute to the implementation of the recommendations set out in this report. OHCHR looks forward to the active engagement of standard-setting organizations, states, and civil society in this project and encourages their support for its aims. OHCHR stands ready to assess existing processes, to advise on efforts to integrate human rights into standard-setting processes, and to provide the Council with updates on the project and standard-setting related developments at large. The report recommends that the Council remain seized of this matter. I next wish to present the compendium on good practices of the OHCHR in relation to the access to medicines and vaccines in the context of the right of everyone to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. This report is submitted pursuant to HRC Resolution 50-13 and is the first of a series of 3 reports. It will be complemented by an analytical study on key challenges and culminate in a comprehensive study that will be submitted to the Council in 2024. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us, among other things, that universal and inequitable access to vaccines, medicines, and treatments is essential to reversing the trajectory of any pandemic. It also exposed the fault lines in universal and equitable access to medicines and vaccines, and it reconfirmed the significant impact that this has on a range of human rights, including the rights to health, to life, to non-discrimination, and to development. Despite its significance for the realization of human rights, massive inequalities in access to medicines, vaccines, and other health products remain. The needs of persons living in poverty, older persons, persons with disabilities, women, and children were often underestimated, ignored, and underserved. Governments, national and international actors, the private sector, and civil society have a shared responsibility to provide access to medicines and vaccines for all. It is essential that states guarantee the right to health in compliance with their obligations under the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Framework, and that pharmaceutical companies live up to their responsibility to respect. Among the few good practices of promoting the availability, accessibility, acceptability, and quality of essential medicines, vaccines, and other health products identified in the context of this compendium are practices that are underpinned by a human rights-based approach and that ensure meaningful participation of all concerned, including civil society organizations and patients and consumer organizations. They include policies that promote competition in the pharmaceutical industry, access-oriented management of intellectual property rights, strong regulatory frameworks, and price regulation. Maximizing the availability and accessibility, and in particular the affordability of medicines and vaccines, also involves increasing funding for research and development, as well as innovative models for procurement and distribution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your report. Colleagues, my understanding is that we have a couple of delegations asking for the floor in order to exercise the right of reply. And the first on my list is Thailand. Thailand, to have the floor.
Mr. President, Thailand wishes to provide clarification on the issue regarding people crossing border that was mentioned by one civil society organization as follows. Thailand-Myanmar border have from time to time caused Myanmar people to cross into Thailand. Since 2021, we have received several waves of movements with the total of around 46,000 Myanmar people fleeing unrest. They were allowed to stay in the humanitarian areas along the border and provided with shelter, food, water, and other essential items, as well as medical treatment by Thai authorities and local communities, in line with established procedures and Thailand's long-standing humanitarian tradition. People came and returned within a week. We have allowed them to stay on our side as needed and never pushed them back to danger. In the past 2 weeks, shelter and assistance is provided to more than 4,700 Myanmar people fleeing conflict into Thailand. All of them still remain under our protection. Thank you.
Thank you. Azerbaijan.
Mr. President, I'm taking the floor to express our right of reply to the statement made by Armenia during today's interactive dialogue with Special Rapporteur on Human Rights of IDPs. One should remind Armenia that it is the last country to lecture us on international humanitarian law. What is Armenia poorly attempted to depict as a violation of IHL is a sovereign right of Azerbaijan to rebuild its own territory left totally destroyed by Armenia during its illegal occupation. While rebuilding and restoring its territories, Azerbaijan takes all necessary steps to ensure the preservation of historical heritage. Let us remind what were the textbook examples of violations of humanitarian law by Armenia. After the ceasefire of 1994 till 2020, during the years of occupation, it was Armenia who, as a continuation of its policy of ethnic cleansing, had been systematically preventing the return of displaced Azerbaijanis while simultaneously facilitating the illegal settlement of Armenians. Armenia sought to prevent and deter displaced Azerbaijanis from returning to their homes. Throughout nearly 30 years of its occupation, Armenian forces spread terror among the Azerbaijani population in neighboring districts and attacked and killed Azerbaijanis residing close to the former line of contact. In addition, the Armenian authorities sought to ensure that displaced Azerbaijanis had nothing left to return to in the occupied territory, territories, in particular through total destruction of property, mosques, historical monuments and other civilian infrastructure and cultural heritage of Azerbaijan. More precisely, around 700 historical monuments, 22 museums, 927 libraries and 58 archaeological sites were destroyed, plundered or misappropriated by Armenia in the then occupied territories. Azerbaijani religious sites were also destroyed and desecrated. Out of 67 mosques and Islamic religious shrines in the formerly occupied areas, 65 have been completely destroyed and 2 mosques were significantly damaged. To further the intentional erasure of Azerbaijani presence from those territories, places that historically bore Azerbaijani names were given new Armenian labels. Armenia's ethnic cleansing campaign had emptied the formerly occupied territories of Azerbaijan from its Azerbaijani inhabitants, and Armenia actively began its illegal settlement of ethnic Armenians from Armenia and the Middle East in clear violation of international humanitarian law. Armenia is also responsible for allowing the widespread destruction of land in the formerly occupied territories through fires that have resulted in environmental and economic damages. Overall, all the actions of Armenia in the then occupied territories, including destruction, long-term and severe damage to the environment, illegal settlement and construction of new roads, represent violation of international humanitarian law. A country which during 44 days war used ballistic missiles to attack peaceful citizens and towns of Azerbaijan has no right, neither legal nor moral, to blame others through fabricated misinformation and spear campaign. I thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We wish to exercise our right of reply to the statement made by the 2 NGOs during the interactive dialogue with Special Rapporteur on the internally displaced persons. Natural disasters, horizontal conflict between groups of people, and attack of armed criminal groups become the 3 major causes of IDP situation in Papua provinces. The government of Indonesia has always been and will always deliver a quick, inclusive and comprehensive humanitarian response whenever necessary. From 2018 to 2023, around 10 billion rupiah or around 600,000 USD have been delivered as humanitarian assistances to the IDPs and people affected in the Papuan provinces. This is delivered in form of cash and other humanitarian essentials like emergency tents, foods, clothes, sanitary products, emergency schools, and emergency trauma centers. We have also seen a considerable number of IDPs return to their home. The latest return on our note that we just received is the IDPs in Maibrat Regency, where a task force consisted of many different elements assisted the return process, including by renovating more than 1,000 homes, repairing bridges and roads, providing essential supplies like food and medicines for the first 6 months after their return, etc. In doing the humanitarian response in Papua provinces, the government has not worked alone. Teams from ministries, national human rights institutions, Red Cross, churches, civil societies, we have worked hand in hand. Mr. President, we regret the fact that both NGOs have abandoned constructive approach and opted for sensationalism. Our government has not once closed opportunities for dialogue. Despite their approach, rest assured we remain open for engagements to strengthen promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Armenia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. There is no hierarchy of suffering, and all types of displacement should be dealt with in a victim-centered manner. We know it well, as Armenia has been affected by a long history of unaddressed waves of displacement and land dispossession. Around 400,000 Armenians were displaced due to massacres and attacks of Azerbaijan in the 1990s. In 2020, Azerbaijan unleashed a new aggression against Nagorno-Karabakh, perpetrating despicable atrocities and forcing almost all its civilian population out. Several international human rights watchdogs, such as the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, documented in detail the violations of IHAL and IHRL against the Armenian population. Time and again, the Azerbaijani war of aggression made obvious the latter's discriminatory strategies employed to displace by force the indigenous Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Baku takes possible measures to trivialize and legitimize the ethnic cleansing it perpetrated and to prevent the return of the forcibly displaced population to its ancestral homes. It is a conflict-induced displacement par excellence, accompanied by violations of housing, land, property rights, as part of discriminatory strategies employed to displace the indigenous Armenian population. In decades, Azerbaijan spared no efforts to induce displacement of the Armenians as its way of addressing the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. It is indicative that there are no Armenians living in the territories that fell under the control of Azerbaijan. Few civilians who didn't manage to escape, especially disabled people and elderly, were tortured and executed. The tripartite statement of November 9, 2020 established a ceasefire that could have laid grounds for further work. However, Azerbaijan has continuously hindered the access of the UNHCR and other humanitarian missions to the conflict zone. Azerbaijan tries to prevent the international community from registering the atrocities and human rights violations it continues to commit. The 6-month-long blockade of the Lachin corridor and the siege of Nagorno-Karabakh carries on with the same policy of ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Armenian population. Previous practices leave no doubt that Azerbaijan is ready to commit violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law to meet its objectives. There are all early warning signs of looming atrocities. It is the duty of the international community to prevent them from happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Japan, you have the floor.
I would like to exercise or right of reply to the statement made by the representative of China. With regard to the discharge of Alps treated water into the sea, Japan has been undergoing the review by the IAEA, which has authority to adopt and apply international safety standards based on the Charter. Japan has been explaining to the international community based on the scientific evidence in a transparent manner. Since February 2022, IAEA officials and international experts, including Chinese experts selected by the IAEA, visited Japan and have conducted safety review and regulatory review. Today, the IAEA presented a comprehensive report summarizing the outcome of the review missions from the mutual and professional standpoint based on the scientific evidence. The report concludes that the discharge of the Alps treated water into the sea is consistent with relevant international safety standards and would have a negligible radiological impact on people and the environment. National review and monitoring activities envisaged that will continue after discharge into the sea is commenced. Japan will never approve the discharge of water into the sea in a manner that endangers human health and the marine environment. Japan has been taking measures strictly abiding by relevant international law while giving due consideration to international practice and will continue doing so. The water to be discharged is water further diluted from Alps treated with which has been sufficiently purified until the concentration of radioactive materials other than tritium is below the regulatory standard. Use of contaminated water is not based on the scientific evidence, and therefore we urge correction. As for tritium, which is found in the water discharged from the nuclear power plant in general, the concentration will be 1/7 of the WHO drinking water standard after the dilution. In annual terms, this amount of tritium to be discharged is equivalent to about 1/5 to 1/7 of the amount of the tritium discharged into the sea from nuclear power plants in China. Through the Alps treatment, which has sufficient and stable purification capabilities, the concentration of radioactive materials other than tritium will be less than 1% of regulatory standard. The radiological environment impact of the discharge were assessed in line with the international guidance, taking into account the effect of bioaccumulation and long-term accumulation. It shows the impact of the humans and the environment would be minimal. Japan, the discharge was not selected from the economic point of view. Japan has been and will continue explaining this matter to the international community in a highly transparent manner and based on the scientific evidence. We strongly urge China to communicate on this matter from scientific standpoint. Thank you.
Thank you. China, you have the floor.
谢谢主席。美国、英国和国际人权服务社为了抹黑中国、阻碍中国发展，不惜充当撒谎者和谣言制造者，对中国进行攻击抹黑，充分暴露其将人权作为遏制打压别国工具的险恶图谋。中国对这样的卑劣行径予以谴责和坚决反对。中国已多次阐明对人权高质办所谓涉疆评估报告的严正立场。该报告未经授权，以有罪推定的假设为基础，将虚假信息和谎言作为信息来源，对中国进行污蔑和污名化。联合国消除种族歧视委员会通过所谓涉疆决定，基于美西方及反华势力编造的虚假信息，抹黑中国人权状况。中方对以上坚决反对，绝不接受。新疆维吾尔族人口从2000年的834万人增长到2020年的1162万人，增长率近40%，哪里来的种族灭绝？反而是攻击中国的美国、英国，在殖民侵略其他国家过程中犯下了严重的种族灭绝罪和反人类罪，遗留问题至今仍严重侵犯人权。这些国家自身存在种族歧视、人口贩卖、强迫劳动、难移民权利和土著人权利受到侵犯等严重人权问题。中国始终尊重人权、保障人权、发展人权，致力于维护国际公平正义，推动国际人权事业健康发展。任何势力妄想污蔑抹黑中国、阻碍中国发展，都将以失败而告终。针对日本代表所答辩，中国进行反答辩。中国反对日本强行向海洋排放核污染水的立场是一贯的，向全世界转嫁核污染风险，既不道德也不合法。中国敦促日方正视国际社会和国内民众合理关切，停止强排海计划，切实以科学、安全、透明的方式处置核污染水，并接受严格国际监督。近日有韩国媒体等持续报道，日本通过其他方式对国际原子能机构综合评估报告实施了不正当的影响，这加剧了国际社会对日本核污染水排海的疑虑和担忧。日方如一意孤行，必将会为自己的错误行径受到谴责，付出代价。谢谢主席。
Thank you. And the last country on my list, at least for the time being, for this first round, is Moldova. Moldova, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Republic of Moldova would like to exercise its right of reply in response to the statement delivered by the International Council of Russian Compatriots. We regret to be taking the floor after the segment allocated for civil society in the Council that we strongly support. But we regret even more that the Council civil society segment is being used by those illegally and illegitimately controlling the Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova to directly attack the independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Republic of Moldova and to undermine the Transnistrian conflict settlement process. The Republic of Moldova has called numerous times for international fora not to forget the Transnistrian conflict within the internationally recognized borders of the Republic of Moldova and the plight of the people living in this region of the Republic of Moldova who face grave human rights violations perpetrated by those in de facto control. It was us who continuously called for unrestricted access for international monitors in this and other grey areas that the frozen conflicts are in terms of human rights protection. But let us be clear, the intention of the statement presented from the NGO desk is to lie and manipulate the public opinion, to mimic cooperation with international organizations, and to present this as a step towards international recognition of the unconstitutional authorities. We would like to remind those who attempt to undermine the conflict settlement process that by no means does the act of speaking to the Council from the NGO desk equals international recognition. We also reiterate our pledge to continue the efforts to ensure the respect and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms of all those living in our country, including in the Transnistrian region of the Republic of Moldova, and to place the rights of the people affected by the frozen conflict at the center of our actions. Thank you, Mr. President.